Now I'm your boss.
You think you belong here? I'm the boss of this place, and don't you forget it! Get out from here with your papers!
They laughed the moment the girl stepped into the luxury gala alone. 12 years old, dark skin, simple dress, no parents in sight. Whispers followed her like shadows. Some mocked her clothes. Others smirked and tossed money at her feet, assuming she was lost or begging. The billionaire host laughed the loudest. "You don't belong here, little girl," he said, amused. She didn't cry. She didn't argue. She simply looked up at him and spoke softly. "I'm your boss." The room erupted in laughter. What no one knew was this. The quiet child they humiliated owned the company funding the entire event. And in just minutes, their laughter would freeze into fear. Bailey Grant was only 12 years old when the world decided she was invisible. 6 months earlier, her life had been shattered by a single phone call, a private plane, bad weather, no survivors. In one cruel afternoon, Bailey lost both her parents, the only people who had ever truly seen her. By law, she inherited 87% of Grant Global Holdings, a multi-billion-dollar empire built from decades of discipline, vision, and sacrifice. Newspapers called her the youngest self-made billionaire heir in the world. Stock markets reacted. Lawyers celebrated. But none of that comforted a child who still slept hugging her mother's scarf. On paper, Bailey owned everything. In reality, she controlled nothing. The boardrooms were filled with adults who spoke around her, never to her. Contracts were signed. Strategies were changed. Her name appeared on documents she never saw. At the center of it all stood Richard Hale, the company's CEO, a man who believed grief made people weak and children irrelevant. "She's just a signature," he once said privately. "She won't show up." That belief gave him confidence. Too much confidence. The annual Grant Foundation Charity Gala was approaching, an event Bailey's parents had hosted every year, not for publicity, but for purpose. Scholarships, hospitals, community programs. It was their legacy of kindness, not wealth. Bailey listened quietly as adults assumed she wouldn't attend. They were wrong. That night, she chose to go, not as a billionaire, not as an owner, but as a daughter. She wore a simple dress her mother once loved. No security entourage. No announcement. Just a small girl carrying a heavy heart. As she stepped into the glowing hall of chandeliers and silk gowns, conversations paused. People looked at her, then past her, then dismissed her. Whispers crept through the room, sharp and careless. Who is she? Why is she here? Does she belong? Bailey walked forward anyway, holding on to one truth her father had taught her long ago. Power doesn't need permission to enter a room. She didn't know it yet, but the moment she crossed that doorway, the illusion holding that empire together was about to crack, and everything was about to go wrong. The CEO noticed her the moment she stepped fully into the light. Richard Hale paused mid-conversation, champagne glass frozen near his lips, eyes narrowing as they landed on the small girl standing alone among silk gowns and tailored suits. For a second, confusion flickered across his face. Then it turned into a sneer. "Well," he said loudly, his voice slicing through the music, "did someone's maid bring her kid to work?" The words landed like a slap. Laughter rippled across the room, polite at first, then louder, more comfortable. The kind of laughter people use when they don't want to be the odd one out. Phones slowly came out. A few guests smiled awkwardly, unsure. Most did nothing. No one stopped him. Bailey froze. She had expected stares. She had expected whispers. But not this. Not a grown man, powerful and celebrated, turning her into entertainment. She clutched the folder in her hands. The documents her guardian insisted she carry. Proof, authority, ownership, papers she barely understood but had been told were important. I'm here for the gala," Bailey said softly, her voice barely rising above the hum of the room. Richard laughed. "For the gala?" he repeated, amused. "Sweetheart, this room costs more per minute than your entire life." More laughter. He stepped closer, towering over her, and plucked the folder from her hands. He flipped through the pages without reading a word, his grin widening as if he already knew the ending. Then, without warning, he let the papers fall. They fluttered to the marble floor like discarded trash. A collective gasp moved through the room, but no one spoke. Richard reached into his pocket, pulled out a thick wad of cash, crumpled in his fist, and tossed it at Bailey's feet. "Here," he said coldly. "Pick it up." Silence followed. Not the respectful kind. The cruel kind. Bailey looked down. The money lay scattered among the papers bearing her parents' names. Her hands began to shake. She felt every eye in the room on her, judging, filming, waiting to see what she would do. She searched the crowd for a friendly face, a protector, an adult, anyone. There was no one. The room was filled with senators, executives, donors, investors, people who made decisions that affected millions. And yet, not a single one stepped forward. Because to them, she wasn't a child in pain. She was a problem. A moment they didn't want to interrupt. "Go on," Richard urged, his voice dripping with mock patience. "That's what people like you do, right?" Something inside Bailey cracked. Her knees buckled as she knelt on the cold marble floor. Tears blurred her vision as she reached for the scattered papers, her fingers trembling as she tried to smooth the creases. The cash felt heavy in her hand, not because of its value, but because of what it represented. Humiliation. The cameras zoomed in. Some people whispered, uncomfortable but still silent. Others nodded, as if this was normal, acceptable, necessary. A little girl crying on the floor was a small price for maintaining order. Bailey's tears fell freely now, silent and hot. She wasn't crying because of the money or the laughter. She was crying because this was the same room where her parents once stood, applauded for their generosity. The same gala where her mother had danced barefoot at midnight, laughing. The same event where her father had promised, "This company will always protect the powerless." And now, no one protected her. Richard turned away, satisfied. "Someone get her out of here," he said dismissively. "We have real business to discuss." Security hesitated, not because they cared, but because something about the girl felt wrong, out of place in a way they couldn't explain. Bailey stood slowly, clutching the documents to her chest like armor. Her tears stopped, not because the pain faded, but because something deeper replaced it. Stillness. She wiped her face with the back of her sleeve and looked up. Her eyes met Richard's again. "I said I'm your boss," she repeated, her voice soft but steady now. The room erupted with laughter once more. Louder, crueler. Richard chuckled. Someone escorted her fantasy back to reality. He turned his back on her, but behind him, unnoticed by nearly everyone, a man at the far end of the room had gone completely still. An elderly board member, one of the originals. A man who had helped Bailey's parents build the empire from nothing. He stared at the papers in Bailey's hands, at the signature, at the seal, and his face drained of color, because in that moment, he saw what the rest of the room was too arrogant to recognize. They weren't humiliating a powerless child. They were kneeling, unknowingly, before the true owner of everything around them, and the reckoning was seconds away. The humiliation should have ended there. It should have dissolved into awkward apologies, quiet corrections, someone finally stepping in to say, "This has gone too far." But instead it lingered, thick and suffocating, hanging over the ballroom like a poisonous fog. And while most of the room shifted uncomfortably or pretended nothing was wrong, two people did not move at all. Bailey's legal guardian stood near the back, hands clasped tightly in front of her, knuckles white. Her face was calm, but only on the surface. Years of restraint held her still. She had promised Bailey's parents something sacred. When the time comes, let the truth speak for itself. Beside her stood the family's attorney. Older, composed, eyes sharp with recognition. He had spent decades navigating boardrooms like this one, watching powerful men destroy themselves with arrogance. They waited, because sometimes justice doesn't shout. It doesn't rush. It doesn't beg to be seen. Sometimes justice is patient. Richard Hale mistook that silence for victory. He adjusted his cufflinks, smiling as if the problem had already been erased. To him, the girl was done, reduced, broken, and now removable. "This is harassment," he announced loudly, waving toward Bailey. "Disrupting a private event. I want her out." A pause. Then, with absolute confidence, he added, "Call the police." A murmur spread through the crowd. Police? Some guests shifted, uneasy now. A few lowered their phones. Others leaned forward, sensing drama, but not yet understanding its weight. Bailey stood frozen. Her heart pounded, not with fear, but with something else, a quiet ache. She had lost her parents, her childhood, her sense of safety. And now, in front of the world, she was about to lose something even more fragile, her dignity. She looked around again, not searching this time, but observing. Faces she would remember forever. Faces that had chosen comfort over courage. Then she felt a hand gently touch her shoulder. Her guardian leaned down, whispering so only Bailey could hear. "You did nothing wrong." Bailey nodded. Richard, emboldened by the room's silence, pulled out his phone. "Yes," he said sharply, loud enough for cameras to catch every word. "I have a trespassing situation. A child disrupting a private corporate gala." "Yes," send officers immediately. That was the moment. The attorney took one step forward, then another. His movement was subtle but deliberate, the kind of motion that only people with real authority make. Conversations began to fade. Heads turned. "Richard," the attorney said calmly. The CEO scoffed, not even looking at him. "This doesn't concern you." "Oh," the attorney replied softly. "It concerns everyone." He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a thin folder. Unlike Bailey's, this one was pristine, untouched, official. "Before law enforcement arrives," he continued, "I believe the board and the public deserves clarity." Richard finally turned, irritation flashing across his face. "You're interrupting my event." The attorney smiled faintly. "No, I'm correcting it." He looked toward the crowd, toward the cameras still streaming live, toward the investors, donors, journalists, people who suddenly felt the room shifting beneath their feet. 6 months ago, the attorney said, Grant Global Holdings underwent a legal transfer of ownership following the tragic death of its founders. A hush fell. Richard's smile stiffened. The majority stake, 87%, was inherited by their sole surviving heir. Murmurs broke out now. Uneasy, confused. Richard laughed nervously. And, the attorney said, his voice steady. According to corporate law, that heir is the ultimate authority of this company. He turned and gestured toward Bailey. The room froze. Bailey felt her breath catch as every eye swung toward her, not with ridicule this time, but disbelief. "This child," the attorney continued, "is not trespassing. She is not disrupting anything." He paused. "She owns this company." Silence slammed into the room. Phones trembled in hands. A glass shattered somewhere near the bar, the sound sharp and final. Someone whispered, "That's not possible." But the attorney wasn't finished. "She has chosen not to exercise her power publicly until tonight," he said. "Not out of weakness, but out of grief." Richard's face drained of color. He stammered, "That's impossible. I would have known." The attorney met his eyes. "You were informed. You simply chose not to believe a child could outrank you." The board member at the far end stood abruptly, chair scraping loudly against the floor. "It's true," he said, voice shaking. "I've seen the documents, the signatures, the trust seal." More board members stood, one by one, a domino effect of realization. Richard took a step back. This is a misunderstanding," he said, his confidence crumbling. "She's a minor. She can't." "She can," the attorney interrupted. "And she does." Outside, faint sirens began to approach. Richard had called the police thinking he was asserting control. Instead, he had summoned witnesses. The cameras were still rolling. The world was watching. And in that charged silence, thick with regret, fear, and truth, Bailey Grant stood taller than she ever had before. Not because she wanted revenge, but because the truth had finally arrived. Quietly, perfectly, and the storm was about to break. The attorney opened the folder. The sound was small, but in the dead silence of the ballroom, it echoed like a gavel striking wood. Before anyone moves, he said calmly, these documents need to be seen. He handed the first set to the board chair, then another to the auditors seated near the front. Page after page followed, statements, signatures, dates, account trails highlighted in precise yellow lines. Numbers began to surface, and with them, the truth. Over the last 6 months, the attorney continued, while Bailey Grant was mourning the loss of both parents, funds were systematically diverted from Grant Global Holdings. A sharp inhale rippled through the room. Charity reserves, educational endowments, emergency trusts her parents established for children just like her. He paused. Millions of dollars. Whispers turned into murmurs, murmurs into shock. Richard Hale shook his head, laughing too loudly, too fast. This is absurd. I protected this company. Every decision I made was unauthorized. The attorney interrupted, sliding another document forward. And personally approved by you. The board chair's hands trembled as he read. One auditor stood abruptly. These accounts, she said, voice tight, they were never disclosed to us. Another board member spoke, disbelief cracking his tone. These withdrawals coincide exactly with the trust transfer date. The implication hit like a blow. Richard hadn't just been careless. He had been deliberate. The attorney turned slightly, addressing the room now, not just the board. Bailey Grant was legally restricted from direct financial control during her bereavement period. That protection was meant to shield her. He looked directly at Richard. You exploited it. The room went completely silent. No phones, no whispers, no laughter. Just the sound of a man's reputation collapsing in real time. Bailey stood beside her guardian, heart pounding, not from fear now, but from something unfamiliar. Clarity. She listened as numbers were spoken aloud, as timelines were reconstructed, as lies unraveled under the weight of evidence. Every stolen dollar had a signature. Every forged approval had a timestamp. Every justification Richard had ever given was documented. This wasn't leadership, the board chair said hoarsely. This was theft. Richard's face glistened with sweat. I was running the company, he snapped. Someone had to make decisions. Yes, the attorney replied quietly, but not steal from a child who had just buried her parents. That sentence broke something. A donor near the front covered her mouth. Another turned away, eyes wet. For the first time that night, people stopped seeing Bailey as a disruption. They saw her as what she truly was, a child who had survived unimaginable loss and been betrayed by the very system meant to protect her. The police arrived moments later. 2 officers stepped into the ballroom, alert but cautious, hands resting near their belts. They took in the scene, the frozen crowd, the board members standing, the cameras still rolling. Richard exhaled in relief when he saw them. There, he said quickly, pointing toward Bailey. She's the one causing. The board chair turned sharply. Officers, he said, voice firm. This man is under investigation for corporate fraud and embezzlement. The officers paused. What? Richard snapped. That's ridiculous. I'm the CO. The attorney stepped forward again, holding out the final document. Not anymore. He turned toward Bailey. For the record, he said gently, this decision requires your confirmation. The entire room shifted toward her. Bailey felt the weight of it. The chandeliers above, the eyes around her, the legacy behind her name. Her guardian knelt beside her, whispering, You don't have to rush. Bailey looked at Richard. She didn't see power anymore. She saw a man who had laughed while she cried, who had thrown money at her feet, who had mistaken silence for weakness. Her voice was quiet, but it carried. My parents built this company to protect people, she said, not to hurt them. Richard opened his mouth to speak. Bailey lifted her chin. I am Bailey Grant, she continued, and as a majority shareholder and legal owner of Grant Global Holdings, she paused, not for effect, but for strength. I am terminating your employment, effective immediately. A breathless stillness followed. The board chair nodded once. So recorded. Richard staggered back. You can't. Yes, the attorney said. She can. The officer stepped forward now, not toward Bailey, toward him. "Sir," one officer said, placing a hand on Richard's arm, "we need you to come with us." The sound of metal cuffs clicking shut was sharp, final. The same hands that had crumpled cash now trembled. The same man who had demanded a child kneel was being escorted through the very room he once ruled. No one laughed. No one filmed. They watched in silence as Richard Hale was led away, his authority gone, his arrogance exposed, his downfall complete. The doors closed behind him, and for the first time that night, the room exhaled. Bailey stood very still. The board chair approached her slowly, respectfully. "Ms. Grant," he said, choosing his words carefully, "on behalf of this company, we owe you an apology." Others followed. Executives, donors, people who had looked away when it mattered. "I'm sorry," one whispered. Another bowed his head. "We should have spoken up." Bailey listened, but she didn't respond right away. She walked to the center of the room, the same marble floor where she had knelt. She looked down at it once, then back up at the people surrounding her. "I don't want revenge," she said softly. "I want honesty." Her voice didn't shake. "I want the money returned to the charities my parents cared about. I want this company audited completely. And I want safeguards, so no child ever stand alone like I did tonight." The board chair nodded. "It will be done." A pause. Then applause broke out. Not loud, not celebratory, but respectful. Bailey didn't smile. She didn't need to, because power had finally spoken. Not through shouting, not through cruelty, but through truth. And standing there, in a room that had once tried to erase her, Bailey Grant reclaimed something far greater than wealth. She reclaimed her voice. The cameras were still rolling when Bailey stepped forward. The ballroom no longer felt like a battlefield, but the weight of what had happened pressed heavily on her small shoulders. Bright lights hovered above her. Microphones waited. Reporters leaned in, searching for outrage, expecting fury, triumph, revenge. What they saw instead was a child holding herself together with quiet courage. Bailey's hands trembled slightly as she rested them at her sides. She took a breath, then another. When she spoke, her voice wasn't loud, but it was clear. "I'm young," she said. "I'm grieving." The room fell silent again. "I lost my parents," Bailey continued, her eyes steady despite the tears threatening to return. "And some people thought that meant I was weak." She paused, choosing her words carefully. Not like a billionaire, not like a CEO, but like a child who had learned too much, too soon. "But I'm not powerless." Something shifted in the crowd. Bailey didn't talk about humiliation. She didn't describe the laughter or the money thrown at her feet. She didn't name Richard Hale. She didn't need to. Instead, she spoke about dignity. "My parents taught me that power isn't about who you can silence," she said. "It's about who you protect." She looked directly into the cameras now, not accusing, not angry, just honest. Tonight, people saw what happens when someone is treated like they don't belong, when they're judged by how they look, how old they are, or how quiet they seem. Her voice softened. Most people who go through that don't have billions. They don't have lawyers. They don't have cameras watching. A murmur rippled through the room. "They just suffer in silence," Bailey said. That was the moment many people looked down. Because for the first time, the story wasn't about a billionaire child humiliating a powerful man. It was about a system that only listens when wealth demands it. Bailey straightened her shoulders. "I don't want this to be remembered as a scandal," she said. "I want it to be a lesson." She announced that the stolen funds would be returned, every dollar, to the charities her parents had built, that the company would establish an independent ethics board, that youth protections would be written into corporate policy, not as a gesture, but as law. The crowd listened. Not because she was rich, but because she was right. When she finished, there was no applause at first, just stillness. Then someone began to clap, slowly. Others followed, not thunderous, not celebratory, respectful. Bailey stepped back, her guardian gently placing an arm around her. In that moment, she finally allowed herself to exhale. That night, Headlines would circle the world. People would debate power, privilege, race, age. Some would focus on the downfall of a CEO. But the truth was simpler. A child had walked into a room that tried to erase her, and walked out having changed it, not with anger, not with revenge, but with courage. And long after the cameras turned off, long after the gala lights dimmed, one thing remained undeniable. Bailey Grant didn't redefine strength by showing how powerful she was. She redefined it by proving she never needed cruelty to be strong. That night was never about a billionaire winning. It was about a child who refused to be erased. Money didn't protect Bailey Grant. Lawyers didn't save her. Even power didn't arrive until it was invited. What changed everything was her voice. A small, shaking voice that chose truth over fear, dignity over revenge, courage over silence. In a room filled with expensive suits and louder egos, Bailey reminded the world of something we often forget. True power doesn't shout. It doesn't humiliate. It doesn't demand someone kneel to feel tall. Real power stands firm when the world tries to push you down. It speaks calmly when cruelty expects tears. It protects others instead of proving dominance. Bailey didn't walk away celebrated for her wealth. She walked away respected for her character. Because dignity isn't bought. It isn't inherited. And it certainly isn't granted by status. Dignity comes from knowing your worth,